think we are going to get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Daniela Bleichmar. I am the director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities at USC. Thank you so much for joining us today. We do ask that if possible, you turn on your camera. It's always nice to see faces rather than still photographs or names. And we are here today for one of our book chats. This is a monthly series in which we celebrate and discuss recent books published by faculty at USC. And I am delighted today to be discussing this brand new book, hot off the presses, by James McHugh, professor of religion at USC, entitled An Unholy Brew, Alcohol in Indian History and Religions, published by Oxford University Press in late 2021. Joining us today are Harshita Kamath, Associate Professor in the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Studies at Emory University, and Miriam Kingsburg-Hadia, Professor of History at the University of Colorado Boulder. And the moderator for today's conversation is Varun Soni, Dean of Religious Life at USC. So very quickly, James will give very brief comments about his book, and then our invited discussants will engage him in conversation about the book for about half an hour, more or less, and then the floor will be open for questions from the audience. So thank you so much for joining us. And James, please tell us about your book.
Thank you, Daniela. And just a couple of thanks before I start. So I'd like to thank the Levan Institute for the Humanities for setting this up and all their hard work, Daniela and Isabella, making this happen. Also, this is co-sponsored by the USC Center for the Pre-Modern World. And last but not least, Harshita, Miriam and Varun and the audience for all sort of taking time out for another Zoom event, which I feel like we could all, like, we all came to a Zoom thing. That's a miracle. So thank you. A book about alcohol in India. And I guess, you know, one of the, how I, years and years and years ago, some of you might have heard of this sort of mystery drug of ancient India, soma. Actually, I deal with that in the appendix of the book because in an appendix, because soma hogs the limelight at every turn. And I got really fascinated by soma years ago, but then I kind of ended up working on other things like perfume. And then when I was coming to the end of that perfume project, one of the texts I used was this sort of encyclopedia of royal activities, 12th century South Indian Hindu, well, the king involved was Hindu. And there's this whole big chapter with loads of recipes for drinks and a big description of a drinking party. And I was just always been intrigued and sort of started dabbling in it. And I just couldn't understand it to save my life. But these recipes with all these drinks, I was like, what are they? And you know, they seem to, in the latter part of the chapter where they're all drinking, they all sort of seem to have slightly varied significance, you know, like sort of Guinness versus champagne. It sort of has a different feel to it. And so I just started working on it. And well, one, there was nothing on it really. There's a few articles, but not much really. And there's just like nothing written about it. So I just sort of started working on it, and it was just this ginormous kind of worms and rabbit holes, worms in rabbit holes. And it just sort of took off. And then, you know, there were the drinks. Then there was like, well, what do we know about drinking? And then there's people maybe are more familiar if they've sort of taken a class in Hinduism with the sort of more sort of religious laws restricting it. And then maybe sometimes people have heard of this sort of tantric sort of drinking practices, but they're very sort of third order. So I just sort of tried to do a big survey just to get a feel for it. I mean, some of the issues involved were like, you know, the texts are often very full of conventions and artifice. So, you know, can we really tell anything from them? That's a big methodological problem. And also, even though actually it's quite a big book and I actually had to cut it by a third, I still feel like it's quite a superficial introduction to the topic, and we need lots more work in this area. And so, yeah, so it's a big, you know, is this sort of initial survey of the terrain, I'd say, is how I feel about it. Because like literally there isn't really much about alcohol in India there. Everyone's obsessed with soma, cannabis, things like that. yoga, things like that. But like alcohol doesn't tend to get on the map. So yeah, that's really that's my sort of introduction to how the book came into being and sort of some of the big issues involved with doing it. And I mean, as for sort of some sort of unifying thesis, there's so much in there over such a long period, you can't have that. But my main hope really is it just sort of, like you grab the Oxford Companion to Wine, the entry on India is very sparse really, and it shouldn't be, you know what I mean? Or the Oxford Companion to Beer, or something like that. Probably just has IPA in there or something like that. But like, it should have all these interesting ancient Indian beers in there. Yeah. So yeah, that's my introduction to the topic.
Thanks you so much, James, for that. I've been looking forward to this book for a really long time. I wish I had it growing up as an Indian American teenager to show my parents that there was a basis for alcohol use, but next generation can benefit from that. I'm grateful to be able to invite our extraordinary colleagues, the respondents, to engage the conversation with James. We have with us Miriam Kadia and Harshita Kamath. I will be moderating the panel discussion, and then we'll go to a Q&A after that. So Miriam, maybe we can start with you and to get us started today. And you're on mute.
We've all had so much practice with Zoom. I can't believe I still make this mistake, but I do. I guess maybe before I ask a question to kick off the conversation, I just want to offer a couple of reactions to the book and maybe to James's much too modest summary of his contributions. I feel like I'm coming at this from the perspective of somebody who does not study South Asia or the ancient world or alcohol. So it's really a tribute to how accessibly this is written that I found so much in it to appreciate and to learn from. While the erudition of the book is still very apparent, even to somebody who doesn't specialize in any of its keywords. I also just wanted to say right off the bat how much I loved the clever organization, the rounds as parts, the cups as chapters. There was a playfulness in this book that I found not just endearing, but also really true to the material. I think more of us should write history like this. I did want to ask, I guess, to start us off, a question about the title. The title of the book is an Unholy Brew, but I read the text as rather presenting alcohol in a more complicated way, showing how it's compatible with or even necessary for some religious practices, while also being subject to religious moralizing. So I thought maybe it would be interesting for me to hear reasons why you chose to emphasize the unholy aspects in your title, or what you're trying to convey about the material through the title.
Thank you for those very generous comments. I went to great lengths to make it very accessible. I had it edited twice as the press editors, and I sort of worked with my own editor because I was determined to make it sort of readable. So I'm very pleased to hear it is somewhat readable in some parts at least. The title, well, that's a sort of bit of a funny story really, because that was sort of chosen for the proposal and sort of grant applications and things. And I was sort of using unholy, partly sort of with religious vague implications, but also unholy, like, what's that unholy noise this morning? You know what I mean? That sense of unholy. I don't know how much that's common in America, in fact, but that kind of, what was that unholy crashing thing that the builders were doing next door? Sort of big, spectacular, sort of annoying, sort of in your face. Sort of god awful, you know what I mean? And so that's what it was. But then you're right. I realized as it was going on that it wasn't a great word, but then I was sort of like locked in because I'd sort of like quoted it as forthcoming Unholy Brew. And somebody, I think Patrick Olivelle said he had as famous scholar of Indian law. So I was kind of stuck with it. And actually, it's funny, I actually wanted to change it to an ocean of Surah. Surah being the goddess, and it's a very common type of Sanskrit name for text to call them the ocean of X. Or, so I was going to call it, and there is an ocean of Surah in Indian mythology, so I really did want to call it by the end An Ocean of Sirah, and it's just a lesson getting trapped with a title because it's because the project took so many years. I was sort of stuck with it. So yeah, good point. But it was very pragmatic by the end. I was kind of trapped with it. Yeah.
It really speaks to the differences between British and American English. I guess I'm familiar with the usage now that you mentioned it, like of an unholy racket, but it definitely didn't come to mind before you illuminated that. That's it seems so appropriate now that you've explained it.
All right. Thank you.
Should I continue, or would it be preferable to turn the floor over?
Sure. Why don't we move to Harshita? We'll go back and forth, and we're really looking for a conversation. So
yeah, and thank you all, and I know that many of you, I have a whole set of questions that I've written down, but I know that some of you have not read the book. But I just want to also plug, like Miriam, this wonderful book that I read over the break and thoroughly enjoyed. I had sort of ran away from my kids playing Monopoly so that I could read it next to the fireplace, if that's any indication of how accessible it's written. And I loved hearing James's voice come through in various chapters. You would see him and hear him in the kind of, imagine, right? He's having these drinks and he drops his authorial voice, I think, in various parts of the book. I will also just say that as someone who works with texts, I am so jealous, James, of your topics. I was jealous the last book. And then when you told me that you're writing this book on alcohol, I was like, man, he gets all of the good ideas. Why? And all the funding for them. So I'm thrilled to see it in its finality. I will also add that my colleague Ellen Goff is here, and she's actually teaching it this semester for one of her graduate seminars. So it is actually being read and being taught. So congratulations, and I recommend highly for anyone at any stage to pick up the book. So I guess a question that I had, some of the themes that I was really intrigued by, and I'm aware that some of you may not have read and may not have had access to certain chapters, so I'll try to do my best in terms of giving a little bit of context, is in chapter 4, which I think was probably my favorite, and it's titled Luxurious Erotic Drinking and Literary Texts. And it's thinking about the kind of ways in which there are these hyper-stylistic literary understandings of drinking, of romance, eroticism, Sringara, and as well as humor. And so there is that intersection between those things, that is drinking, the erotic, and humor, feature in many poetic scenes, but I was really interested in the ways in which gender played out in those scenes, like how women become women who are either drunk or drunkards, as you note. And can you tell us more about this kind of connection between intoxication, eroticism, and gender? And I know that you talk a little bit about the role of the courtesan, but I'm just wondering, especially for those who haven't read the book, kind of to help us think through that connection.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you again for those comments. It's actually, I think in a way one of the more revealing texts about gender is one of the ones that's in that chapter. There's this text called the Brihat Katha Shloka Samgraha. So let's call it the Great Story. Just to, it's a big title. So the Great Story, just to simplify things. This text has kind of some really quite detailed, revealing descriptions of kind of couples getting together to drink. This is something that's actually sort of prescribed in the Kamasutra as a kind of like almost necessary prelude to lovemaking, that you drink. I always think it reminds me a bit of maybe both in practice, and certainly in sort of representations of the sort of post-coital cigarette. What was it? I was watching some movie the other day, and probably everyone knows this. There was some movie and people are on a bus and there's a couple that are like really making out a lot on the other side of the bus. And at the end of their whatever, they both lie back. You don't see anything, but they both lie back on the bus and smoke a cigarette. And we all know what that means, you know what I mean? So in many ways, did that translate into me? I wasn't there in the 70s. So, well, I was, but I was too young. So in a way, the alcohol and the lovemaking sort of do go together in this sort of like kind of quite clear way, and chewing beetle is sometimes part of that as well. And so it's seen as this sort of prelude. In the Kamasutra, one of the 13th century commentators sort of talks about the alcohol as a sort of preparation for love, a mental preparation for the lovemaking. And I think this is for both partners, but as with a lot of Sanskrit poetry, the emphasis is on sort of, we're looking at the woman, we're observing the woman, we're talking about the woman. But this great story that I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, everything in that text is kind of backwards and upside down and inside out, everything. So there we have these two scenarios where there's a man who does want to make love, but he's kind of inhibited, his family, so sort of consent is there, but there's this sort of unwilling sort of coyness, maybe sort of social pressures, and a woman has him drink. And I almost feel like in that case, because the text is so inside out, you kind of get, you know, the sort of exception that proves the rule. And you get these rather interesting descriptions of how it works, that he's desirous, but kind of inhibited for various reasons, family, society, upbringing, other concerns, sort of self-discipline. But then how, when he's kind of taken over by intoxication, lust also, he sort of opens the doors to lust at the same time and is able to make love. So there's that kind of mechanism of it in the poetry, and it's weirdly spelled out most clearly in the Kamasutra in this kind of, this strange sort of topsy-turvy text. But then there's also this other side, which is we are often in these texts, there's this Manasulasa, this encyclopedia of royal activities, and there's a kind of drinking party where the women get drunk, and as far as we can tell, the king doesn't. And so all these queens from the harem get drunk, the king doesn't, and they become a spectacle. And so they're kind of like crying and laughing and trying to kiss the king, and it makes them a sort of heightened erotic spectacle. So I think in terms of the sort of preparations for drinking, it does apply to men too, but the sort of spectacle thing does seem to mostly apply to women. But I don't know if like alcohol's sort of unique in that, as you know, it's like that kind of applies to a lot of things in Indian literature, but it definitely is gendered in that respect. At least the literature is. And I'd actually be interested to know with your own. You were just saying about like, well, we need alcohol in Telugu texts, in Tamil texts, and you know, so I'd be interested to see how this sort of connects to your materials as well.
Yeah, maybe just briefly I can chime in, and then I'll ping it back over to Miriam. But that was actually my next question. So I've been in this reading group with a Telugu scholar based in India, Kari Ramachandra Reddy, and it's organized by David Shulman since I think March of last year. And we've been reading Durjati's Sri Kalahasti Mahatmyamu, which is it's a text about a Shiva temple, Sri Kalahasti, and the kind of story around that temple. And so there are these scenes, and it's related to this question about gender, and whether these kind of drinking parties are kind of scenes in which we have these highly stylized images of women who are sort of drunk and stumbling all over the place. When I was reading your book, I kept thinking about this one verse that's in this text of basically a group of drunkards that are so drunk. And this is a 16th century text, right? It's a text that's intended for a temple. It's very much about devotional practice, but there's this beautiful, like, just poetry about this one particular verse in which it's like, there are those who are standing there shouting at the sky. There are those who are stumbling over. They try to walk and they fall over. There are those who like start to speak, but then they forget what they're saying. Like they're about to say something and they're so drunk they can't even remember. And then there are those who are like stretching out their hands, but they're passed out essentially, and they want more alcohol. And then there are those who are eating like savory snacks. And so all of like everything that you mentioned in your book, I was like, this is all there in this one verse. But what was interesting there, and I guess this is related to the earlier question, was just like there's this kind of excess of drinking as it comes to women's bodies within many of the sources that you examine. I also found it with caste. So in this case, these are all shabras, they're all hunters, and that this kind of gambling, drinking, party, revelry is happening in the context of quote unquote non sort of upper dominant castes. And so I was wondering if you could talk about that as well. Like, do you find that caste also plays within these conversations? I know it does later in the legal text, and I can ask you about that, but.
Oh, right. Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, that sounds amazing now. I'd like to hear more about that verse. Actually, that reinforces those sort of strange things about the intoxication drinking, that like, you know, the drunk woman is sort of seen as more desirable, but sometimes they're weeping, they're sort of messy, you know, they're unkempt, which is often seen as not that great in Indian literature. So they're sort of crying, they're weeping, they're shying, you know, their makeup's all running, you know, they're like a mess. And in terms of their own desirousness, they sort of flip from like anger to laughter to love, like from second to second. So their experience of erotics is also very changeable, if you know what I mean. So it's kind of strange that it's seen as sort of heightening the erotic situation, but sort of both as subjects and as objects. Their sort of aesthetic experiences are very jumbled, in fact. Yeah, and as for caste, that I think I've seen, you tend to get that. I'm trying to remember. I think I have seen a few sort of references to sort of people living in the countryside having these kind of sort of parties. That would kind of connect with this kind of descriptions of drinking, sort of in the drinking festival, this sort of concept of gramya, which is sort of rural, bawdy, common. It's kind of seen as charming gramya, but it's also seen as, you know, sort of, you know, it's a bit sort of common, but sort of charming, if you know what I mean. So I think that would fit with that pretty well. But in the literary texts, it's often kind of, well, you know, it's often, you know, queens in the harem, all these sort of supernatural beings like apsarisas and things like that. So it doesn't, in the literary text, it sort of seems to have, there's a little bit of that in the ones I was looking at, but perhaps less of that. And then the caste thing you would see more in maybe these kind of more moralizing stories, where you have these sort of like laborers and workers kind of like having loads of like, I don't know, sort of spicy fish and beer at the end of the day or something like that. Yeah.
Miriam, Harshita, you know, is a South Asianist, and she's able to reflect upon her own textual work to find some connections. I'm wondering, when you read this, studying Japan in a different historical period, were there paradigms or approaches from the book that might have helped you think about the work you study in a different way, or other regions or religious traditions?
Second time I've started speaking without my microphone on. Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to be able to address this. So James and I know each other through the Society for the History of Alcohol and Drugs. And my work focuses on the history of narcotics in East Asia, especially 20th century East Asia. So a lot of my questions for James, I think, will take us in a little bit of a different direction, because I'm very interested in the contributions that this book makes to the history of intoxicants. I really think that we have a lot to learn from how you situate alcohol within a larger history of drinking, not taking them as overlapping categories, but looking at both drinking and alcohol on their own terms. I also just loved the comprehensiveness of your attention to everything that goes along with drinking, right down to the little bar snacks that were traditionally consumed. Sort of the references and material on bar snacks actually made me wonder, maybe if I could ask you to build on some of those ideas, and ask if there are any ways that alcohol functions as a food in early South Asia. Can we use any of the frameworks that can be drawn from food studies, not just the study of intoxicants, but actual ideas about the nutritional qualities of alcohol or their caloric contribution? How can we read these sources to understand alcohol as a food?
Thank you. Well, the first comment about the snacks is that's the thing that emerged increasingly and made the book even more complicated, is that the drinks, and just like in Harshita's quote she just did, they always go with snacks. The drinks always go with snacks. It's just universal. So you can't consider them without snacks. And then I realized that often the, pan, beetle kind of is involved too. And then beetle actually involves several components itself. So it sort of expanded into this kind of, you have to add lots of things to the mix to understand the whole thing. So that's one thing there. But in terms of food, so there is the actual food that you would have with it. But in terms of food studies, some medical texts, they will talk about it as sort of helping you get plump. It does tend to be taken separately from food, and it does tend to be perceived as, it's delicious, but it's delicious like food would be. And it's made of food. People obviously know that. But it does tend to be sort of perceived as the purpose of having a little drinking session, which is a drinking session, is for the effects, the sort of mind-changing effects, body-changing, sense-changing effects mainly. But then you get into the question though of how much do we know about what was really going on? You know what I mean? Because obviously you can say things like, obviously something like these rice beers would have had a really high calorific value. And in the process of making fermented drinks, something like sort of village rice beer or a toddy, especially a slightly longer fermented village rice beer, you get all this yeast which dies and kind of provides various vitamins. So so that would actually be useful for people on a sort of sparse diet. You might just be having rice and a tiny weeny bit of lentils, very poor farm labor. But if you're adding some beer, you're getting some really useful vitamin contributions, which I think we can actually assume was probably going on, and it probably was sort of useful to be drinking beer for quite a lot of people. And then it makes you think about people who weren't allowed to have beer. In fact, it's almost like if we sort of accept the sort of calorific and maybe vitamin content of these early drinks, which wouldn't have been filtered, so they would have had much more sort of sludgy stuff in them. If you accept that, then you sort of think about the communities. You think of sort of poor Brahminical communities that they might not have had tons of dairy, and they'd have actually been at a disadvantage dietetically. In fact, sort of observant poor Brahmins might have been, if they didn't have access to hardly any dairy products, if they were really poor or something. You can imagine that, but it's hard to actually go there with the text because we get into that thing with sort of what was really happening being highly, and actually that's something I'd really like to see is archaeologists looking more into this kind of material for South Asia, which hasn't happened a lot. I was at one point discussing this with somebody who works on Harappa, the Indus Valley, and I was going, hey, there has been a little bit on that, but I was sort of asking somebody who works on it currently, have you found anything? And the archaeologists were like, oh, we don't really sort of tend to think about looking for that, which is strange if you think about it, because there's so much beer in Mesopotamia, and then there's tons of beer in Vedic India, and it's well, you'd think it might be there too, you know what I mean? And there is, there has been a bit of work on that, but it's not the first thing that tends to come. People tend to focus on food a bit more. So actually, it's almost the opposite, that people tend to focus on food a lot in India, and should maybe move to alcohol. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Maybe your book will help swing the pendulum a little bit.
Yeah, hopefully for some, people might be sort of more inclined to look for it in certain places, I think. Yeah, hopefully.
Do we have time for another round?
Yes, we do.
I guess maybe Harshita, it's your turn.
Harshita?
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to also just note, like Miriam noted about the contribution to kind of the broader study of alcohol. One thing that's kind of just amazing about this book is how many different genres of texts you examine. Like scholars don't do this. I hang out in the literary world. I don't look at the law texts. I don't, look at tantric materials. And you just have every cup, not chapter, but cup really brings together such a wide range of sources. And it's really a kind of incredible accomplishment that you were able to engage that, and I can see how you ended up cutting out materials that could have been added in. So I'm wondering if you could talk through, for those of you who haven't read through the book, tell us about how genre, in terms of types of text, influences the ways in which alcohol is envisioned. So I'm trying to think about I was just talking about the literary text, but then like you get to later in Cup 7, you talk about the kind of Dharmashastric law models around drinking, and then you would get to the tantric materials right at the end. So how do you think that these kind of if we can even call them genres or different philosophical schools or traditions in which a text may have been composed influenced how alcohol was treated in those specific cases?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, that wide-ranging genre thing was, I'm sure you can all appreciate, absolute nightmare, because suddenly I was like, I had to sort of talk with confidence about tantra, and it went from like Rig Veda, like Atharva Veda, which is really ancient, like Atharva Veda is like about 1000 BCE, and a very different type of Sanskrit in fact, and to 18th century tantric text.
I know, it's amazing.
It was awful. It was awful. I'm not doing that again. I'm not doing a book like this again. It almost killed me. So, but it was kind of fun. But the thing is, they did. Well, they obviously sort of something like well, in a way they deal with it very, obviously legal texts deal with it very differently to literary. But what I was interested in, and that's why I ended up doing them all, is how much they sort of elucidated each other. So how it's kind of well known that these tantric rituals, where the tantric rituals are doing things like, say, a community like Brahmins who shouldn't drink, where in the ritual they are drinking, it's sort of kind of commonly known that is a kind of inversion, transgression of sort of like, Orthodox Hindu law. But if you really, really, really understand the Orthodox Hindu alcohol law, you can make a much more nuanced reading of what the Tantra sort of transgression exactly is doing. And then to understand the Orthodox law really well, it helps if you kind of, when they're listing various drinks you can and can't have, depending on what sort of caste you are, Varna you are. If you know that, one's champagne, one's White Claw, it sort of like makes a lot more sense. And then that like bounces off into the tantric understanding as well. So, in as well as the sort of differences, I was actually kind of interested in the way that they all sort of they elucidated each other, and it wasn't just completely linear, because I actually kind of feel like I learned a lot about sort of the understanding of brewing and the nature of drinks from things like legal commentaries, which would then feed back into my understanding of recipes. So it was this sort of very sort of large interpretative circle, and but yes, I mean, the thing is, like, recipes are a good example how they kind of crop up in all sorts of genres. In fact, like you've got recipes in ritual texts, you've got recipes in medical texts, and so alcohol's sort of cropping up everywhere. But sometimes it's like medicine, sometimes it's transgressive. I've got all these tantric recipes I've not even like worked on yet. Sometimes it's these transgressive offerings to sort of invert the legal norms. And sometimes the recipes are in a commentary on the Kamasutra or something like that. So, it's almost hard to begin with the complexity of the genres.
Well, it's a remarkable feat because it's a lot of different types of material.
Yeah, I'm not doing it again. Not that.
Well, I'm aware of time. I can keep asking questions, but I want to give Marion a chance.
I know we have so much.
Sure.
I know we have so much we could continue to talk about, but I do want to pivot to a opportunity to open it up for questions and answers, and then we'll come back to our panelists at the end for final reflections. All this conversation, James, made me feel better about getting thrown out of my boarding high school for drinking. I should have told my dad this was actually a very dharmic thing that I did, but I didn't have that wherewithal back then. So let's open it up. If you have questions, comments, observations, please raise your virtual hand and I'll call on you. We have a limited amount of time. I know this is partly about religion, but I'll ask for questions as opposed to sermons, just so we can get through more. And we'll start with Lisa.
Thanks. A quick point and a quick question. I just want to note that St. Bridget's Day is on February 1st, the Irish saint, and she's famous for a poem that begins, "I'd like to prepare an ale feast for Jesus, a lake of beer." Yeah, what I'd like to ask you, James, is why you feel compelled, besides your secret love of chemistry, to try to recreate the products that you write about in the smell book and in this book.
Oh yeah, thank you. I sort of dabbled in that a bit, not very successfully always. Partly, well, you sort of learn two things. If you sort of observe professionals doing it, say I was in Shaoxing in China, went to see lots of the yellow Huangjiu, I can't speak Chinese, I'm forgetting, yellow wine being made. And when you see it being made properly, you realize just how much sort of years of skill and generations of skill go into it. And then you can sort of help understand the recipes a bit better when you've seen these things done. Got to get beyond simply, sort of going around an English brewery tour when you've seen other forms of brewing in practice. But also when you do it yourself, for one, you get a bit of a hands-on feel for it, and you kind of get to see these substances and see how, you know, the rice dissolves when you use this sort of microbial, this sort of fungal saccharification, which they use in a lot of East Asia for turning starch to sugar, in something like Japanese sake, for example. You kind of get to see that. And when you've sort of seen it like happen with your own eyes, you kind of appreciate it a lot more, and it helps you. I mean, I kind of interpreted there's one word in Vedic Sanskrit, which sort of made a lot more sense when I'd seen that liquefaction taking place. But also you realize how rubbish you are at it. And then that really highlights, you know, the sort of implied, you know, skills of all these brewers, because sometimes the recipes seem quite simple, but when you try it yourself, you realize there's an awful lot more going on. I mean, this isn't a with sort of these kind of archaeological reconstructions, they can be useful, but also the sort of rubbishness of your attempts are also really revealing often. I was once, it's not an alcohol thing, I was once in an Ayurvedic pharmacy, some traditional Indian pharmacy, and there was these two guys grinding sort of liquids, sort of white, milky looking liquids. And I said, what are they? And he was like, oh, he's grinding pearls in rose water. And I was like, oh, yeah, it's nice. And I was like, well, how long are you going to be doing that for? And he said, oh, just 2 weeks. And it's like he was going to sit there for 2 weeks all day doing that. And so I feel like sometimes when you get these archaeological reconstructions, or the sorts of things I did, you kind of go, oh, well, it says do this. And I did it. And it didn't work very well. But it's just like, well, not only are you meant to have like a sort of professional violinist, like decades of training, but two, it might involve feats like that you are not perhaps prepared to do or even aware of, and weren't written down. When it said stir it, it might mean something like that. You know what I mean? So it was just generally very useful. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Someone once told me we write what we know. And so for all the young scholars out there, I think James's work is a really beautiful example of leaning into the things that you already care about or are passionate about, especially if it's a multi-year project. You really need to start with the momentum, and that passion gets you there. Lindsay.
Sure. Hey, James, thanks for this. I'm actually teaching a GSEM on drunk history right now.
Oh.
Yeah, so I have a bunch of my undergrads in here listening. So I was just curious if you could tell us a little bit more, since we haven't had a chance to look at the book, like what are people drinking in India in the pre-modern period? And then, you know, do you have a sense of how it was similar or different from, you know, other areas of the world at the same time?
Yeah, it develops over time, as far as we can tell from the texts. And this is where it would be handy to have a little bit more archaeology, sort of going over this for all periods, in fact. But you know, earliest periods, the prominent things is called surah. We don't have recipes in the earliest texts. A few centuries later, we do. That's a grain beer, millets, sorghums, barley, rice. Early versions seem to use maybe some sprouted grains, so a bit of malting to get these enzymes, these starch dissolving enzymes. But there's also these sort of completely untranslatable other things you add, which might be microbes added to sort of affect this sugar starch thing. Then, you know, yeast does starch sugar thing, and then the yeast works on that. Later grain beers, which are a major category, and there's lots of different, many different names, subsections of these grain beers. They all mostly, not all, in fact, mostly seem to use the same method seen in a lot of East Asia. You see it in Korea, Southeast Asia, Japan, China, where you add molds to the grains. You sort of cook the grains, add fungi molds, which digest the starches to sugars, and then parallel. It's a whole sort of microbial culture you add, in fact. Not so much in Japan, but elsewhere it's kind of big old mess of complicated things. And you basically go in this sort of porridge. You go from cooked rice or other grains to a sort of slushy porridge, which has got alcohol, and you filter that. So that's a major category of drink, surah. But then, you know, they had sugarcane very early in India, so they were making sugarcane drinks, and lots of sugarcane products. There's so many words for sugarcane product in Sanskrit, it's very baffling. It's one of those, it shows how into it they were. So, you know, there's ones made with sugarcane juice, ones made with various sort of processed brown sugars and things like that. Spices added. A lot of them had spices, sort of spice mixes added. So you've got sugar, the whole class of sugarcane drinks. You've got imported wine, probably imported from sort of places like parts of Afghanistan, modern Afghanistan, and later on probably modern Iran, probably. So that was probably an expensive import. And other things, you've got things like jackfruit wine, palm toddy appears. That might have been there really early, in fact, but they didn't mention coconuts till quite late, strangely. Palm toddy, which is a sap drink, which is probably quite like pulque, in fact. That's kind of, it's a sort of quickly made sap thing, is big as well. And yeah, so they have a lot of drinks. By about the year 600, there's a lot of drinks, and that, you know, a lot of them are in a given list of drinks. A lot of them will crop up. In fact, they have honey mead as well. So I think that's kind of a striking thing, that compared to a lot of world regions, they had like a load of different alcoholic drinks. You know what I mean? Compared to, say, something maybe Lisa, maybe in a sort of ancient island, maybe had, I don't know how many drinks they had. I guess they had mead and beer, maybe wine as well. But they had loads in India, like dozens.
Thank you for that. Great question. Other questions or comments?
Daniela.
Yes, we have something in the chat.
I was going to say there's also in the chat, and it's more directly pertinent if you want to go with that first, and I'll wait.
Oh yeah, I'll take that. Yeah, not completely sure. I think distillation is first mentioned around 1200-ish. You have a couple of centuries later, you have discussions, you have descriptions of sort of certain North Indian cities where there seem to be distillers. And in a way, you know, if a lot of the liquor is just being distilled, I mean, in the Mughal period, imported wine was significant. That was posh. So very tentatively, I think the posh drink in the Mughal period was imported wine. And maybe the other drinks were they were all distilled. So in a way, it doesn't really matter if you're just kind of getting this kind of, because they won't have been distilled like some amazing eau de vie that's kind of aged in fancy barrels. They're just being like quickly distilled. And so in a way, the distinction then between the sort of sugarcane origin or the grain origin doesn't matter. So if you kind of look at descriptions of so-called, what we now call in India, country liquor, these are sort of like white liquors from, say, the 19th century, you know, people don't really bother much. I mean, they'll make it from rice made in this saccharification mold way, or they'll make it with sugarcane. But you know, the distinction doesn't really matter so much because the end product's actually pretty similar with a kind of pretty crude distillation. So I think that's my literally extremely tentative thing. Is grape wine remained posh, imported. Everything else was sort of differences were eliminated by distillation. But that is literally a hypothesis. So we need somebody who does food in Mughal times to work on that, Neda. It will be a great topic. Okay, Daniela.
Thank you. Well, this comes as a very, very much an outsider to the field. And like Lisa, I was interested in the methodological question. I was impressed by the range of genres of textual sources, as was mentioned, and also by your comparative approach. And I could tell that you were reading some history of science and, you know, sort of different approaches to what happens when you make something, right? I was thinking about Pamela Smith's project on making and knowing, and the idea that making is a way of knowing, but also when you learn how people made something, you learn something both about the making, but about other things. You also mentioned Otto Sibum's recreation of experiments. But I was very intrigued by your very quick, note at the beginning saying like, well, text, there's so many texts and so much in text about this, but text might not be the best sources for getting at this. And you also said this today in your comments. And I wanted to hear more about what other kinds of evidence you might want to work with. And, as a historian who works with material culture and visual culture, I was wondering, for example, about that and what that might offer that is different from text. But it's really open methodologically. If texts only get at some things, what else would you like if you could have it?
Yeah, well, that's the thing, if we could have it. It would be great if we had like lots of really good archaeology on this, and that would really help supplement it. And so that would be my first request, I think. I think texts, especially from the second millennium in other languages and earlier ones in Tamil language, would be really good. So somebody like Hashta and sort of her South Indian language people, they'd be in a great position to look at that, or people working on later periods in, say, Persian and Urdu as well. So like Neha Bermani there. Yeah, so that I think that would be good. That wouldn't necessarily actually the early materials in the South Indian language, they would kind of play into my stuff as well a bit. And I think mainly archaeology. Visual materials I did look at, and it was interesting, they did correspond, for the most part, they closely corresponded. They really sort of echoed the, whether it was just the sort of conventions of the Kamasutra and also seen in literary texts, the visual materials were really, really very similar to those almost. There's a few things from the northeast, from this region, northwest, sorry. North, east and west, I feel like I'd have that down by now. From the northwest, this region called Gandhara, there's sort of images of winemaking there, but that's kind of a bit exceptional. And I looked into that a bit, but I think mostly really more archaeology would be brilliant for this, in fact. And yeah, I think that's my main hope for the future. There's these vessels, there's this whole distillation controversy, sort of ancient Indian distillation. You might have seen as this still you get in Indian museums and textbooks. I've written a whole article. I mentioned it somewhere in the book. I wrote an article about it as well. But we do have these mystery vessels, and I don't think they were used for distillation, but they're there. And say somebody like Patrick McGovern at the university, the Archaeological Museum at Penn University, he'd be in a great position to analyze residues in those jars, for example, and try and find out what was in those. That would be really helpful. So hopefully some things like that will happen down the line. Thank you.
Thanks, James. You've given a lot for young archaeologists to think about and areas of study for them if they're on this call. I'm sure that they can follow up with you as well, because there seems to be a lot of opportunity in this space, in that field. We're running low, short on time here. I'd like to move to a kind of a lightning round and invite the respondents to offer some final reflections or thoughts, or even pose a question or two to James. And then we'll leave some time for him to have the last word. So I'll go back to Miriam for some final thoughts on today's conversation and on James's extraordinary book.
This went by so fast. Now I feel like I had a long list of questions and I didn't properly prioritize what I should have asked you. I think from the perspective of a modern historian, I know it's not one of the chapters you attached for reading, but I was particularly interested in Cup 3, where you talked about the production and consumption of the variety of alcoholic beverages that were available in ancient India. And it struck me that in your description of the profitability of brewing, what we have here might have been a site for capitalist development. Knowing nothing about the ancient India field, and of course your sources won't discuss it in those terms, it seemed to me that this was an opportunity to learn about the development of a market economy or a consumer culture in early India. I also thought that brewing could you present it as sort of a site for the expansion of state authority. So I thought there could be interesting things we could learn from alcohol about the power of the state in ancient India. So if we had more time, I really would have liked to hear your thoughts on that. But since we're so low on time, I guess maybe I just can't resist the temptation to ask you. You're a present narrator in the text, and allude more than once to a drinking experience or two. So I am curious about any empirical research you might have done on some of these ancient beverages that you allude to.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, I tried quite a lot of them. As much as they survive, or sort of similar things survive. So I used research money to, but it was actually really productive in terms of understanding text. But yeah, I tried, toddy, sort of spent quite a lot of time looking at toddy tapping. They make quite a lot of these sugarcane herbal ones for medicinal reasons, and some of them have like iron filings in, so they're not exactly fun, but some of them are all right. Like a well-made dark chasava is quite nice. So I've tried those, and I also saw some of the Indian versions. There's different ones made by different communities in parts of India, some of those rice beers. There's one I'm actually really disappointed, and that was a pandemic thing I didn't get to go and try, is this Marwa liquor, which is very unique and to South Asia. It's this very large, it's an enormous tree, and it drops all these like flowers that are full of nectar. They almost look like grapes or something. They're so full of, and then they dry them, and they're full of sugars. And it's kind of like, well, you can plant the tree, but you put the tree in the ground and it grows. And various communities collect these, and you can store them. And well, now they make a sort of brew out of those and sort of dark brown sugar jaggery and distill it. But it's got this really super distinctive flavor that's like not quite like anything else. So I imagine it's like mezcal or something, but like Marwa, you know what I mean? And so I was really my hope is to kind of get to India and taste some well-made Marwa, but they were all very interesting. Everything was very good. That is a thing, because sometimes you'll read books about sort of ancient winemaking, and they'll be like, oh, well, the way they made wine in ancient Greece, it must have been disgusting. They didn't have like sterilization. It's just like that, yet again, a completely, the guy grinding things for 2 weeks had been like, it completely underestimates, and this connects to Daniela's comment about the sort of history of science stuff as well, as utterly underestimates the amazing skills. Just think of sourdough, how good people got at sourdough making. These drinks can be delicious without sterilization, without scientific equipment, and everything I had was sort of very natural, and it was very good, and actually a lot better than a lot of natural wines, which are just made by like weird French hipsters that haven't got a clue half the time. You know what I mean? So
I think you've made a very compelling case for an ADHS meeting in India at some point.
For sure. And a reminder of how much fun field work can actually be. Harshita, a final question, comment for
Sure. I was thinking about Daniela's question about what are the other kinds of sources that you might have used, and in your response, and to say that, so James and I were participating in a material Vaishnavism conference a few weeks ago, that question reminded me that you actually do work with material culture. You're looking at material culture in texts. And so thinking about the ways in which your first project and your second project are really about material substances. They just might not be the actual physical stuff. They're about how they're told and what do we know about them in our textual sources, which is oftentimes in South Asia all we have. So, so I just wanted to put in a plug for the kind of material culture element that you're doing. And I'm wondering, I'm sure we're all curious, what's next after this project? I know you talked a little bit about beetle as a possibility of another article, but I'd love to hear like what else is James McHugh brewing in his head for another project.
Yeah, thanks. Not sure. I mean, in a way, like I've said, it's a bit daunting doing another one of these huge, wide-ranging projects. I'm working on doing a paper on the brain, like the stuff in the skull, what people thought that was, because they didn't think it was the mind. So what did they think it was? So I'm working on that. It's just a sort of small side topic. It might lead into a thing about body fluids. not things like blood are being done, but things like, fat, you know what I mean? And not just in medical texts, but like ghouls and cremation grounds with loads of fat on their fingers and things like that, sort of other types of cooking with fat. So maybe that, and also vague, but I think this would just be too much. I think it would just defeat me. Gold. I think gold, wouldn't that be good? But I feel like the gold is literally everywhere in India from the Vedas almost until today. So it's like, I don't know if I could do gold. I think it would just destroy me, but it could be fun. Yeah. So it'd probably be a bit like these, sort of rather wide-ranging projects, but I don't know how much of it I can handle. I think gold might just be too. Well, the thing is, like, I hung around with loads of alcohol people for this and perfumers for the other one, so I just spent like years hanging around with like gold refiners and gold. I'd be like surrounded by gold on research trips all the time. It'd be kind of amazing.
Well, the aunties would love you. It would open up a different audience for you too.
Yes.
James, I'm so grateful to you for taking time with us today. I encourage everyone to pick up a copy of, I don't know if you can see it, this amazing new book, Unholy Brew. Buy a copy for yourself and your 12 best friends. It's really, as Harshita said, one of those books that you just want to curl up and read. I'm very, very grateful to our colleagues for their generosity of time and spirit. Miriam Kadia, Harshita Kamith, thank you so much for joining us. I hope we can host you on our campus at some point soon, and drinks are on James if we do. And I'm super grateful to all of you for tuning in today. I know how busy you all are, but it was really wonderful to be able to spend this time with you. Very, very thankful to the Levan Institute for everything they do, but especially for bringing us together at this time when we really needed this conversation and each other. And I'd like to invite Professor Daniela Blechmar to close us today.
Thank you. The only thing I want to say is thank you, everyone. Thank you, James, for your book. Congratulations. And also, we do host one of these book chats every month. Every month, we celebrate a new book recently published by a USC author. And on February 8th, so next month and also next week, we will be discussing Cavan Concannon's Profaning Paul. So please join us for us. Another religion book. Somehow you guys ganged up on us this semester. And later in the semester, we will be also discussing new books by Sonia Lee and Andy Lakob. So thank you, and I hope to see you again.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks so much. Great. Good to see everyone.